Welcome to Moving People Forward with Mark Elfstrand. This program is a series of conversations on commonly seen challenges in everyday people's lives. We hope you'll be inspired by the stories you hear today. Perhaps you know of someone who would also benefit. Be sure to share the program link with a friend. Now, here's Mark.
Equality is a foreign word in most parts of our world. Sometimes it's, a caste system. And for others, maybe gender bias seems to rule. And then for many, of course, race has become the challenge to live unafraid. When you hear of a story where the odds are heavy against the person trying to make it in life, you wonder, how does a person survive in that kind of environment? Well, there are exceptions. A man who lost his parents early in life, lost a brother as well in a shooting, almost decided to take his own life. A sovereign God intervened. We're going to hear his story. Thank you for joining us. With me today on Moving People Forward is Jerald January, pastor of the Vernon Park Church of God in Linwood, Illinois. Pastor Jerald, welcome.
Thanks, Mark. Good to be here.
Oh, now you have had what I would call a roller coaster life. I mean, I've followed you for a number of years, and just like I had said in the opening, it's hard to believe that in some cases how anybody makes it through. You've had so many struggles.
Right. It's I tell people you don't want to be me. I got the good parking lot spot because of some of the trials I've been through. My mom was murdered when I was about 3 years old, and it's kind of strange to say I lost my parents. I lost my mom that day and lost my dad too because he actually murdered her. And I didn't really know that he had murdered her until I was much older, about 12 years old. And obviously, apparently, he was released from prison. But that was a horrible way to start off your life. And I actually witnessed it. So it was very difficult for a 3-year-old to kind of even process, the gunshots and I was the last one to see her alive.
But you did, at some point in life, begin to restore some relationship with your father, did you not?
Yeah, the Lord is so good. When I was in college, my freshman year in college, we finally talked about what had happened. He came and picked me up from school and drove me home. And my dad wasn't big on apologizing, but that day in the car, he shocked me because he said, "I want to apologize to you for what happened." And I had only been a Christian for a very short time at that time. I was still a teenager, obviously. And we got a chance to talk about it. He said, he wasn't himself that day. He would have never done it. He didn't love anyone like he loved my mom. And as our lives went on, I became a minister and obviously older. We talked about a lot of things. And even when he passed away, I was honored to preach his eulogy.
Tell me about your brother, Andre.
Yeah, Dre was obviously my youngest brother, and his mom and my dad hooked up together when I was actually almost a teenager. When Dre died, he died when he was 16. He was murdered after he left school. There's never been anyone caught for murdering him. He was shot in the same manner. Actually died the same way my mom died. He was shot in the head with a small caliber gun. And what was so interesting, Mark, in those days in Detroit, there were so many murders that they had to have his viewing or wake on Mother's Day, which was always difficult for me. It was Sunday, Mother's Day that afternoon. Yeah. And we had to go to the funeral home with dozens of his friends to view his body. It was really tough. He was a fun kid. I was really looking forward to seeing what he's going to be as an adult. He never made it.
All right. So, most of us can think back on Christmases and go, hey, that's my favorite time of year. Yay. So now let's travel back in time to 1973 and Christmas Eve. Why is that date so memorable to you? It's
memorable to me because by that time I had reached that was my senior year in high school.
Okay.
I was going to graduate early, but I was miserable. I had this secret down inside me because in those days you didn't talk about murder. You didn't talk about what happened with your parents. In our home, it was just, okay, hush it down. You know about it, but don't talk about it. And by the time Christmas Eve had happened, me being actually an introvert, Mark, people have a hard time believing that, but I am.
I do have a hard time believing that.
Yes, I am. It was hard for me to communicate with people outside of being on a football field, something like that. And I never forget Christmas Eve night, 1973. I was just depressed. I knew what had happened. I loved my dad, but I hated my dad. I went to church because I kind of went with my grandma all the time. You know, I was kind of like her bodyguard. I'd walk with her to church and walk back home and that type of thing. But I never really paid much attention to the preaching. And I never forget, I just decided I didn't want to live anymore. I couldn't figure out how to go forward with my life. And that night I decided to take my life. There was no one home except my grandma. She was sleeping on the couch in the living room. And I put some pills on the bathroom floor. I was going to kill myself, and I started to write her a note, just say goodbye to her and my granddad and that kind of thing, let them know it wasn't their fault. And I know this is bizarre, but I've said it 100 times, times 100. I heard this voice in the hallway said, "Try me first." I hadn't taken the pills yet, so I knew I wasn't high or anything, and I opened the door. There was nobody there. And I remember sitting on the bathtub wondering, who was that? You know, and so I scooped up the pills, and I went and looked at my grandma. She was still sleeping. I laid on the bed in the bedroom, and I said, God, if that was you, put me to sleep, because if you don't, I'll kill myself. And it was early. It's like 9 o'clock. And normally, my whole life, I don't sleep well. So I usually didn't fall asleep even when I was a little kid till 11, 12 o'clock. I remember saying that, and I blinked and opened my eyes. It was daytime. It was Christmas morning. And instead of opening presents with my brothers and I decided to walk to my grandmother's church that morning. And so I didn't have a suit to put on. I just put on a black turtleneck and black leather jacket. I looked like John Shaft. And I remember walking past the Christmas tree, and my family was saying, "Where are you going?" I said, "I'm going to church." I remember them saying during the announcement, there'll be church service on Christmas morning. I just wanted to go to church, and I didn't know really what was going to happen. I walked all the way to church, first time ever in church by myself. And for the first time in my life, Mark, I heard a sermon all the way through. I had already been to a Billy Graham crusade. Someone that took me, I didn't listen to that sermon, but I listened to this one. It was called God's Gift. Huge church. My grandma's church was huge, New Mount Zion Baptist Church. Maybe about 2,000 seats. There may have been 70 people there that day. But I heard everything that man said. And it made so much sense to me that I ran down the aisle to get an invitation. And that's how I became a Christian. So that Christmas Day is also my birthday. It's my spiritual birthday.
So how did your call to ministry come about?
A couple of years later, on the campus, Ferris State University, where I attended school and played ball for a short time. I wasn't very good. I tell people I played Rudy in college ball. Yeah, they beat the hell out of me, Doc.
What did you play? What position?
I played wide receiver.
Okay.
Because when I got to school, they realized I was way too small to play linebacker, what I played in high school.
Okay.
And I looked fast, but I really wasn't. And so, I played a little bit. But anyway, I belonged to a Christian group on campus called the Youth Ambassadors for Christ. And we were about to actually go into summer break. So we had a prayer meeting in one of the lofts of one of the dorms, and we were praying and praying, "Lord, show us your will." And I didn't believe in all that vision stuff, visions, I had a vision of hell, and it scared me so bad. Actually, I remember when I came to, I was huddled up in the corner, and whatever the presence was that day, Mark, I can't explain to this day, it caused everybody in the room to stop praying. They knew something was happening to me. They just stopped, and they asked me what I saw. And I couldn't explain, but I knew this is something I didn't want to have to deal with again. I knew it was hell, very dark. The very next morning, I called my pastor. I stayed up all night, called him at 7:30 in the morning, and when he picked the phone, he said, "Hey, Brother Jerald, you ready to preach now?" I was like, "Yes, sir." "How'd you know that?" He said, "God told me you're going to be a minister," and that's how I was called to it.
Divinely, so to speak.
It was divinely, and really, my personality is I'm a loner, and I'm really very, very shy. So even though it's been all these years I've been pastoring and ministering around the country, around the world, when I'm on stage, I'm different than I am in person.
We're going to take a time out here in a second, but thank you for your vulnerable story about your past. We're going to pick it up here in just a moment. We're going to take a short break, and then we're going to continue our discussion today with Pastor Jerald January, author of A Messed Up Ride or A Dressed Up Walk. And that's what we'll talk about when we return.
God is our safe place and our strength. He is always our help when we are in trouble. This word of God in Psalm 46:1 says it all. God is our safe place. He is our strength. He is our help when we are in trouble. Whenever and wherever we are invited, nationally or internationally, Lutheran Church Charity's mission is to bring the mercy, compassion, presence, and proclamation of Jesus Christ to those who are suffering and in need. LCC is a ministry of presence, to be present with Jesus, to lift up people in times of joy and sorrow, in prayer, and by passing through donations of dollar per dollar to those in need. Through our canine ministries, we respond and deploy with boots on the ground and paws within 24 hours, often sooner, of any crisis or disaster situation we're invited into. Our LCC disaster response teams continue our support, both financially and with our dedicated volunteers, for those communities during their long-term recovery and efforts, which can be years. Disaster response teams also train volunteers through our alert training to equip volunteers to respond to the various types of disasters. LCC's human care ministries work through our churches and pastors to provide financial and in-kind donations, people resources, and emotional and spiritual care. We have strong partnerships with churches and Christian ministries across the U.S. and internationally. You see, for us, the bottom line is making a difference by being present. For people who are suffering and in need with that mercy, compassion, presence of Jesus Christ. Thank you again for allowing us the privilege to stand alongside and serve others. Jesus and your partnership make that possible to touch thousands of lives.
This is Moving People Forward. I'm Mark Elfstrand, and we're discussing the challenges that face a person who has grown up in a world that he never expected. The kind of world that maybe would devastate other people, seeing one of his parents murdered, finding out one of his brothers was murdered as well. But God had a purpose for his life, and we have found out from Jerald January that when that purpose has been fulfilled, God is going to do some remarkable things. Let's pick up our conversation. All right, so part of your history, Pastor, is also working with Promise Keepers, right?
For a brief time, I worked for Compassion International, and I knew Coach McCartney.
Okay.
And attended some earlier meetings, and I actually did a couple of smaller events in Georgia for them as well. They say smaller; there were like 10,000 guys there.
Yeah.
But yes.
So how do you see the impact of the way that, because in the African American community, keeping dads focused on being good dads is pretty important. Promise Keepers really had that message for everybody, regardless of color. Give me your thoughts on that.
Well, obviously, having dad at home, no matter what the culture is important. Historically, here in America, our people were brought here, and when they were brought here, it was intentionally that the homes were broken up. And so there was a culture of divided families. Miraculously, the black community for quite a few years were able to keep that family structure, even though it wasn't designed that way. Historically, my grandma used to always say, the way you bend a tree is how it grows. The more you bend a culture a certain way, there's going to be certain things that happen with it. I was born in the 50s, grew up in the 60s and part of the 70s. And what I saw in our community, in my opinion, had to be part of a plan. It couldn't have just happened naturally. There were so many things that happened to actually force families apart, that culture became part of our culture, even though that's not what we wanted to happen. And so with Promise Keepers and other entities like that, it actually focused on that. And it was good all the way around, Black, white, Hispanic, because every community has problems. And I know this is a different generation, and we've emasculated a lot of the roles of men in this culture. But I know with having a strong grandfather in our home and raising 4 boys, that made a big difference in our lives.
All right. Tell me about your beloved wife of somewhat 30 years.
Almost 31 years, yeah.
31 years.
Yeah.
And you said farewell to her also unexpectedly a few years ago.
Right. 4.5 years ago, Jerald and I were basically, we had just gone on a trip to look for a second getaway home and our eventual retirement spot. And we had returned from a trip down near Orlando. She finally saw a spot she loved. I think she picked a lot of places to go just so she can get out of Chicago. We flew around a lot. And never forget that Saturday morning, Mark. For some reason, we just sat up and talked about everything for 2.5 hours. I had a meeting at the church that I was late for because we just started talking, and we couldn't stop talking. We talked about everything we could think of for 2.5 hours. And it was strange. All the times I'd spend with her here in Colorado, and we lived in Colorado for 15 years as well, we had never done anything quite like that, where we just sat in the same spot for almost 3 hours and talked about the kids, the grandkids, the ups, the downs, the disappointments. We talked about everything. And she made me a little breakfast, and I called, I'm late, I'm running to the church, and I heard her scream from upstairs, so I ran back in from the garage. And she leaned over the banister in our family room and said, "Don't you ever forget, you're Jerald January." I said, what does that mean? And she started laughing and ran back in the room. I got home about 3:30, 4 o'clock. We were going to actually watch a video together, and she wasn't there. She said, "I'll meet you at 4 o'clock. I see she had put the dinner, the meat out to cook the dinner." And for about 30 minutes, I said, well, this is not strange for Jerald. It's Saturday. The malls are open. I always kidded her and said she had a mall ministry. She loved shopping. She blessed every cashier she could find on Saturdays. So that was her Sabbath. And after about 2 hours, I worried. And so I had called her about 10 times. She never picked the phone up, which is not like her. So I called one of the gentlemen from the church, said, "Look, I need you to go help me find Jerald. She's missing." I've never used the word missing, but she would have never not called me back. And we searched for 8 hours. Went and found some friends to help us look at some of the places that she would normally go. And I started sensing that either she was ill or in an accident or maybe passed away. About 1:40 in the morning, we were out in Tinley Park at one of the malls she likes, driving around. I got a call from a friend, said we found her. And then the phone cut off. And then they called back and said, "This is the address," which was only a mile from my house. And I called back a couple times, finally got through, and I said, "Tell me, is she alive?" And they wouldn't tell me. And I told the driver, "Slow down, she's gone." And when I got there, she was sitting in her car. She actually was supposed to go to a store and get my watch fixed. The battery had died, but she had made an alternate route to go to her favorite place, Starbucks, and then to an antique shop because she was picking up a surprise gift for me. She had bought me a rocking chair. I love the rocking chairs that John Kennedy had, so she found one, and she had picked it up. It was in the back of her SUV. And when I got there, it was like, we got there about 1:45, and it looked like a scene from a movie, the tape and everything, and the police were everywhere. And I remember jumping out of the car. It was January the 30th, 1:45 in the morning, and I ran a quarter block. I just jumped out of the truck. And I thought she was still alive for some reason because I could see her because they had the lights on, and she was behind the wheel of the car, and her eyes were open. But when I went to reach for a policeman grabbed me and pulled me back and said, "Sir, she's gone. She's been gone for hours. She had died 9 hours earlier." The coroner said she had a massive stroke, an aneurysm, and died within 40 seconds. They said, "We don't even know how she parked the car."
Wow.
But it took less than 40 seconds for her to pass away. And I remember crawling down the street. She actually died in front of a church. It was a small church on Dixie Highway. And I remember crawling down the street. And I've never accused God of anything, but I was so mad. I think I lost my mind. And the gentleman with me said, "You start banging your hands on the ground and saying to God,
the grief reaction.
This is not what you promised me.
Yeah.
I've done everything you said." And so we had a wonderful services for her. Hundreds of people showed up. We had to do it at a mega church because we couldn't do it at our church. But it probably was the hardest thing ever been. I know it was the hardest thing ever happened to me in my life. But everything else that had happened, that I didn't see coming.
We only have like a minute and a half left. I know it's going to be hard to condense this, but you went through a period of depression not long after that.
Yes.
And how long did that last, and how did you get out of it?
I tell people you never get over grief. You just grow larger and the grief becomes smaller. For the first 4 months, I never even came back home. I never went back to the church. I actually traveled the country trying to get my mind together, and friends would invite me to their city. So that was very difficult. The 4 months after I came back from the time away, my staff was concerned because I lost a tremendous amount of weight. I really couldn't eat. I lost about 55 pounds. Yeah. And eventually I met or re-met the woman that I'm married to now, Mara. Yeah. And it was just an accident. We were talking on the phone about a movie she had made. I was just congratulating her. And she cracked a joke. And actually, that's the first time I had laughed since Jerald died. And those conversations became more, she lived in another state, became more frequent. And a year and a half later, we got married.
Well, you have quite a life story to share. I want to just mention for our friends who are joining us, 2 books by Pastor January, A Messed Up Ride or A Dressed Up Walk. Now, can you get this online someplace?
Yeah, you can go to our website, Vernon Park Church of God, vpcog.org, and just order it through that. Yeah. vpcog.org. Yes.
And a second time examining the sin of racial division that remains in the church today. Now, if either one of these would interest you, again, I want to encourage you to go to the website and you can order them there. And with that, I want to thank you so much for being willing to share your story and give us time today.
My pleasure.
And that's our program for today. Thank you very much for being with us. Don't forget, as the sages have told us, grow in wisdom, think humbly of yourself, and love one another. May it be so with you. Our special thanks to our guest, Pastor Jerald January. Join me next time for more of Moving People Forward. I'm Mark Elfstrand.